At some point, somebody said it. Maybe out loud, maybe just with a look. The games, the records, the same 3 films you've watched more times than you can count. The fact that you still care about things you cared about at 14 and care about them with the same intensity you did back then. Someone decided that meant something was wrong with you. And here's the thing. Part of you believed them. Not fully, but enough that the word landed somewhere it shouldn't have. So let's talk about what the psychology actually says. Not the pop psychology, not the cheap read, the real framework. Because the label is wrong, and the reason it's wrong says something important about who you actually are. The term man-child gets used like an insult, like a man who never finished something he was supposed to finish. And if you're a Gen X man, anywhere from your mid-40s to early 60s right now, there's a decent chance it's been pointed at you at some point. The hobbies that look like a teenager's hobbies, the loyalty to music and films from 30 years ago, the part of you that never hardened the way the world seemed to expect. What nobody tells you is that the thing being called a flaw has a documented psychological origin, a real one. And once you understand it, the label doesn't just stop stinging, it stops making sense. Because what actually happened to Gen X men wasn't arrested development, it was something closer to the opposite. The psychologist who explained it wasn't writing a criticism, he was writing a description. And what he described changes the entire frame. In 2000, a developmental psychologist named Jeffrey Arnett published a paper in American Psychologist. He proposed a new life stage, one that had never formally existed before. He called it emerging adulthood, a developmental window from roughly 18 to 29, sitting between adolescence and full adulthood. Its own territory with its own rules. The cohort he was studying when he built this theory was Gen X in their 20s. You were the research, not the anomaly, the data. Arnett wasn't saying something had gone wrong. He was saying something had shifted. The old markers, early marriage, early kids, mortgage by 28, those had moved. Not because a generation refused to show up, because the structure underneath them had changed. More education required, economy restructured, cultural expectations loosened. The timeline moved, and Gen X moved with it. Which means the decade that previous generations spent converting entirely into adult roles, Gen X spent differently. More time inside their own identity. More time with the things that mattered to them before the world told them what was supposed to matter. More years holding on to the interior life of a younger man because nothing arrived on schedule to replace it. That's not failure. That's what the data actually shows. And here's the part that reframes everything. A University College London longitudinal study tracking the 1970 birth cohort, core Gen X, found that roughly 20% of that group hit their highest ever levels of psychological distress, not in childhood, not in their chaotic 20s, but in their 40s and 50s. Right now, for a lot of men watching this. The researchers pointed at something specific. The masculinity norms of the era, stoicism, self-reliance, don't talk about it, produced men who never built the language to process what happened to them when they were young. So it waited. And it surfaced later when the noise of building a life quieted down enough for it to be heard. Which means the gaming, the records, the films, they're not the problem, they're the signal. And once you know what they're signaling, the whole thing looks different. Here's what the man-child label actually describes when you strip the judgment out of it. A man who kept something most men his age buried. A preserved interior life. Curiosity that didn't switch off. taste that stayed personal instead of becoming purely functional. The capacity to care about something with the same intensity he cared about things at 15. Previous generations converted that completely. It was expected. You hit 22, you got serious. The things you loved as a kid went into a box in the attic, and the box stayed there. That was the template. Gen X was the first cohort where the template cracked. And in that crack, something got to survive that usually doesn't. The man at 55 who still lights up talking about a record from 1987 didn't fail to grow up. He grew up and kept something most men sacrificed without even being asked if they wanted to. That's not a developmental deficit. That's a different kind of outcome. And in a lot of cases, a better one. The men who held on to it tend to be more present with their kids, more genuinely curious about the world, less brittle when life doesn't follow the script. The softness that looks like immaturity from the outside is the same thing that keeps a man interesting to himself and to the people around him at 58. You don't get one without the other. But there's an honest distinction worth making here, because there's a version of this that works and a version that doesn't, and knowing the difference matters. There's a difference between holding on to what you loved and using what you loved to avoid what you feel. The first one is fine, more than fine. The second one is what the research is actually measuring when it finds that distress peak in middle age. A man who never built the permission or the language to look at what's sitting in the quieter rooms of his life. If the games, the records, the films are things you genuinely love, that's the vault. Keep it. It's yours. It's proof that you survived something with your sense of wonder intact, which is not nothing. But if they're the thing you reach for specifically when something gets too loud to sit with, that's worth noticing, not as a character flaw, as information. Because at this point in your life, you have something the younger version of you didn't have. Language. The ability to pick up a phone and say, something's off, and I want to talk about it. The permission to let somebody in to the rooms that have been closed for a while. The vault stays. That's not the question. The question is whether you still need to live in it the way you did when you built it. The man-child label is the cheap read. What it's actually pointing at, when the psychology is laid out clean, is a man who got handed a new timeline nobody explained to him, carried more than the culture gave him credit for, and kept something alive that most men were quietly asked to bury. That's a different story than the one the label tells. If this is hitting something real for you, subscribe. There's more on the way that's built specifically for where you are right now. And if you missed the last video, the one on the loneliness that comes with being a Gen X man who processes the world differently, it connects directly to this. That video is about feeling out of register with the world around you. This one is about being mislabeled by it. Same man, different angle. Worth watching if you haven't. You didn't refuse to grow up. You grew up under a rule book nobody handed you in writing, and you kept something most men didn't. That's not the definition of a man-child. That's the definition of someone who paid attention to what actually mattered.